One of the craziest mother-in-law stories I've covered in a while, and this mother-in-law almost cost OP her job at a prestigious law firm. But wait, it gets much worse. I'm a female 33. I'm a lawyer in a small town where everyone knows everyone and it's pretty much near impossible to keep a secret from anybody. I never thought I would end up somewhere like this, but when I was at university I met my husband Rick. He's 36 male, and it was love at first sight. Yeah, I know that's corny as heck, but it really was. I saw this incredibly attractive man with dark hair, stunning blue eyes across the dining hall, and I just knew I would do anything to get his attention. We dated all throughout university, and I went to his hometown a couple times to meet his parents. I thought it was a nice and quiet holiday, but I assumed I would end up working for a big-time firm in a city. Love makes you change all your plans, and when Rick asked me to marry him, I immediately said yeah. He had told me that he wanted to go back to his hometown to take over the chain of diners that his dad started, and he hoped that I would come with him. Well, I did, and I began working for the only law firm in town under a grizzled old lawyer who knew everything about every family going back generations. At first, I was slightly out of place as the city girl, but over the years, I've come to love this place, and it'll be amazing for our children to grow up safe and away from the big old city. Anyways, I digress. I was given a big talk when I arrived by my boss, Nathan, about people trying to get information from me about each other and to just ignore them. He failed to mention that my mother-in-law, Lucille, was one of the biggest gossipers in town. I did find out fairly early on that there was a ranking system in the town amongst the older women, and my mother-in-law would be considered, the queen bee. She was a member of every club in town, attended the big old church every week, and spent her time getting beauty treatments with her friends or having brunch dates with the other ladies. My mother-in-law, she simply ruled this small town, with the other ladies nipping at her heels to take over the reins. It was a strange thing to watch, and Rick had tried to explain how the dynamics worked. But I still didn't understand it. What was clear, though, was that these older women ruled the town and they knew everybody's dirty laundry. And if they didn't, they would leave no stone unturned until they found out what they wanted to know. The key to holding the title Queen Bee was knowing more than anyone else and being able to use the gossip to subtly put down everyone else while it's not looking like a jerk about it. It was truly an art form. Have you ever heard an older woman say something awful about her, quote, friend, but make it sound like she's being nice? Well, if you live here, you need to have skin like a rhino, because most compliments are just insults in disguise. Let me give you an example of my dear mother-in-law's work. Rick and I have been married for over a year now, and I've worked hard and was being considered as a partner in the law firm. Lucille invited me to come to one of her ladies' bridge nights, which for the record is an awful card game. Anyways, I sat there and listened to the talk, and it appeared that anyone who was not there that night was fair game for the gossip. These women were brutal, trying to outdo one another with what they knew. One would say, "Have you heard about Mary? She's been seeing I'm going to that doctor out of town." There would be a lot of nodding and murmuring, and then someone else would say, "Well, I heard her husband was seen with a younger woman, so she needs to increase her assets." No one would come out and say Mary had gone to see a cosmetic surgeon. That would just gossip around the topic and make barbed comments about her looks and why her husband would be looking at younger women. Of course, though, if Mary had been there, they would have been telling her how young she looked, and her husband would be insane to look anywhere else. I was at the end of one of Lucille's comments that night and made me realize that she did not even restrict herself to people who were not sat in front of her. She said this, "Well, yes, grandchildren would be nice, but you know, these modern women, they're all about a career. I wonder when I'll be a grandmother. Maybe never, they work so much, when are they even in the bedroom?" I was literally sitting right there, whilst they talked about whether my husband and I had enough bedroom time. I never went to another ladies' night because I didn't want to listen to my mother-in-law gossip about whether my husband and I had a sex life or not. So, anyways, that's an introduction to the main characters in the event, which nearly ruined everything I've worked so hard for. and not only put my job at risk, but put a massive strain on my relationship with Rick. I'll talk about how things started to go wrong in the next installment of, quote, Why My Mother-in-Law is an Awful Human Being. Because this has dragged on a bit, and I'm sorry for that, all I wanted to do for now was just tell you about the small town heck I'm living in, where all the women went to church every single Sunday morning and then left to be awful to everyone in town, just like Jesus wanted. Of course, I'm being sarcastic, just in case anyone thinks I was being serious. Well, anyways, I'll update soon with the next chapter of this crazy saga when a potential new Queen Bee is supposed to arrive into town. What's up, guys? Mr. Reddito here. So today's story is a bit different. This one was written in a diary format, so it has about 5 or 6 updates about the Queen Bee and how this town, small town, is getting worse and worse for OP. But let me just tell you right now, a couple of these updates are absolutely a roller coaster. We're going to jump into update 1 right now. If you don't know who I am, my name's Mr. Reddito, and I read stories every single day. If that sounds like something you're into, click that subscribe button, and let's see what's happening in Update 1. When anything new happens here, it's a massive deal. It feeds to women's gossips, mills for weeks, sometimes even months if it's a big enough deal. Well, 6 months ago, one of the older men in town passed away as he had no family and his house went up for sale. Around 6 weeks ago, a sold sign appeared at the gossip mill and went into overtime because it had to be a new incomer, as if someone from town had bought it. Everyone would have known before the ink dried on the paperwork. As it was a couple from out of town who wanted to move to a smaller town for a quieter life now that they've retired. I had to resist the urge to say good luck with that one when they came to sign the papers and pick up their keys. Their lives would be under the microscope of the town's women for months until they knew everything about them. One thing that I did think, though, was that the wife, Penny, could give my mother-in-law a run for her money when it came to a middle-aged glamour. Her hair was beautifully cut and dyed, held in place by what looked like a full can of hairspray, and her clothes screamed money. When I went home that evening, I said to Rick that his mother would have a great time digging into the newcomer's life. And I wouldn't be surprised if the new couple gave as good as they got. They had the same dynamic as my in-laws, overbearing and, well, meek. Anything for a quiet life husband. Rick laughed and said it would be like war of the middle-aged women, and I laughed, little knowing how these two women would cause me the worst of stresses in the upcoming days, upset and sleepless nights of my entire life. In short, within weeks, my mother-in-law and Penny went to war with each other, both determined to be the big fish in this very small pond. Needless to say, it did not end well for anyone involved, but I'm getting ahead of myself. At first, mother-in-law began to test the waters with Penny and went into full welcoming mode. Within an hour of the moving van leaving, she was at the doorstep with flowers and a cake, baked by her cleaning lady, as Lucille did not get her hands dirty with domestic stuff. She handed over a handwritten note, on expensive perfumed paper, of course, with all the groups that were available to a lady with time on her hands. Recommended the best salons for hair and beauty, and invited Penny and her husband to join us for dinner one evening. I'm not sure how Rick and I got dragged into this mess, but we dutifully turned up with a bottle of wine, which was deemed merely adequate. Smiles plastered on her face and a vow to get the heck out of there as soon as it's polite. All in all, it was a good evening. Penny seemed to be testing the waters, and Lucille was actually fairly well behaved. We stayed longer than we expected, and I said to Rick on the way home that maybe they would actually be friends. Oh boy. I was wrong. I was very wrong. So now we have two combatants in place, and we'll move on to the war that started between these two women, who were both old enough to know better, and how I almost became a casualty in my mother-in-law's need to be the queen bee. Little did I know that the first shots were fired in the war after Rick and I left. This only came out later, but as soon as Lucille and Penny were saying their goodbyes, Penny had leaned in for the fake kiss of Lucille's cheek and whispered in her ear, "I hear you run this town, but there's a new player on the block, and I don't play second fiddle to anybody." She said all of this with the perfect smile on her face, and that was it. The battle for the power has begun. Update number 2. I was blissfully unaware of all this because I don't get involved in the complications of women power struggles in town. I have no interest in it, and I'm happy with my role as wife, successful lawyer, and occasional waitress when Rick is short-staffed. It brings me down to earth, and the first sign of trouble came a couple weeks after Penny and her husband moved in. Rick and I do not always go with Lucille to church, as Rick works and usually has documents to do, and I just help him. But that morning, we all went as we were going out for lunch afterwards. Now, you need to know to understand that the people of this town have their favorite pews in church, and families have sat in the same seats generation after generation since God's dog was a puppy. Lucille and family always sit in the third pew from the front on the left-hand side. Always, every week. At least they did that until this morning, because when we arrived, Penny and her husband were sitting there, and Lucille's face, as she walked in the door, would have scared small children. She was absolutely furious. But as quickly as the anger appeared, she regained control, and her usual sweet, matronly mask was back as she walked to her pew, saying hello to her friends as she passed. You could feel the tension in the room. Not usual in church on a Sunday, really, but everyone was waiting to see how Lucille would deal with the interlopers in her pew. We walked forward, and I said to Rick, "Can we just sit somewhere else?" Rick whispered back, "Not whilst my mother's alive. We can't." And I resigned myself to the inevitable confrontation. Well, I cannot emphasize enough how good these women are at fighting with each other, while it's making it look like they're just sweet old ladies who would not hurt a fly. The conversation went something like this. Hello, Penny dear. I'm sorry, I guess no one informed you that this is our family pew. It was remiss of me not to explain how things work here. Lucille, with her sweet smile in place. Oh, I'm sorry, Lucille. I didn't see your name on it. I thought in God's house we were all equal and could sit where we wanted. Penny with an equally sweet smile. Well, maybe that's how it works in whatever church you went to before here. But here, we're much more polite and respect traditions. I would never sink as low to sit in someone else's pew. It's very ungodly behavior, don't you think, dear? Well, this back and forth went on for a while until Penny realized Lucille was not going to budge and the priest was waiting to come in. And so, with a begrudging smile, she moved to another pew, and Lucille settled herself into her normal seat. So, that was a win for Lucille, but it was far from over. One thing that I should explain before we go on as to where I come into the story is that there's 2 types of women within the hierarchy of this town. There's the leaders and the followers. There's always been one woman who's at the top of the pile, and there's a few stronger women always snapping at her heels to replace her at the top. I have no idea why. It's not like they get much for it, except the title of being the gossip queen, and in some cases the biggest jerk in town. Then we have the follows, usually the younger women who try to keep the stronger women happy to prevent themselves becoming prey for the stronger women's gossip. I know it sounds like something from the end of the world dystopian novel, but you might never underestimate the need of these women to be at the top of the food chain. Penny was not new to this game, though, and she began to gain a small group of followers who flocked to her rankings, as they've been subjected to Lucille's cruel gossip one too many times. These women fed Penny all the gossip and facts about Lucille she needed to hold her against the current queen bee. This was when Lucille decided she needed information that no one else could possibly have if she was going to outdo Penny. As you can imagine, this is where I came into the game. Of course, I didn't even know I was a player until it all got out of hand and nearly cost me everything. I was just a pawn to Lucille's queen in a chess game, and she was determined to win. And we all know that in chess, the pawns, well, they're expendable. I'll get into more details about how she tried to ruin my life, but for now, I'll just say as Penny's star began to rise, I suddenly found my mother-in-law seeming to try and build a relationship with me. I thought she was finally warming up to me, but I was wrong. I was just a means to an end when I found out. That's when I began to play my own game, and it was going to get messy. Update number 3. Things went on as normal for a few weeks, at least normal for the women in this town. They met for brunch and gossiped and began rumors about each other again. I did say to Rick a few times that they seriously needed to either get jobs or better hobbies, as they obviously had way too much time on their hands. I heard some parts of the stories, mainly from Rick, who had heard them at work from his mom when she came to the dinner, to complain about how hard her life was now that Penny was living here. She even went as far as to ask Rick how he would go about making someone move out of the town. Rick very sensibly said he was not getting involved in any of this, and that should have been that, except Lucille realized that she had a way in the town's deepest and darkest secrets through me. As I said at first, I thought she was just being nice, but I should have known better. In this small town, it was every woman for herself, and the friendships were only as deep as what you could go out of them. One of the things I missed from university and growing up was real friends. Now all my friends were spread about the country and our conversations reduced to emails and phone calls. The first time Lucille appeared at my office, I thought something had happened to my father-in-law, as my brain could not process any other reason why she would even be there. She smiled, that sickly sweet smile that she used to get her own way, and said she was there to take me to lunch. I was surprised, but decided to just go with it. I needed to finish a couple of papers, and I went to the bathroom before we left. Lucille was in my office alone for less than 5 minutes, and in that time, she turned into James Bond. She used her phone to take photos of the files at my desk, and I found out later that she'd only managed to get a few pages. But, as I said, she started small. We went for lunch at Rick's Diner, and it was actually a very lovely time. She was all sunshine and light, and not one nasty comment about my career over children left her mouth. Now, I know she was making sure she kept me happy, so I would have no reason to stop her little surprise visits to my office. Following that lunch, a rumor began to spread about a younger woman in town, who was currently caught up in a custody case with the father of her children who lived a few hours away. I never thought that she had got that information from my files, and I wasn't even sure she was the source, as she was careful to begin with. It just seemed that somehow, the story had gotten to be public knowledge even though it had been carefully guarded. The young woman was traumatized as her reputation was dragged through the mud, and 100 theories came into existence about why the father wanted to take the children. These women made clients' life a living heck, and things only got worse from there. I'm not sure when I first began to have my suspicions about Lucille as her visits to my office. It was the nudge in my brain for a while that there was too many coincidences of details of our clients' cases becoming common knowledge. As it got worse, the clients themselves began to wonder about the security of our law firm. Then Lucille, she pushed too far and tried to take on Penny herself. Lucille was easily back on the top with all the new gossip that she was providing for the bored housewives, and she wanted to take her rival down once and for all. To do this, she needed Penny's files. As I said, we were the only law firm in a small town, and between my boss and I, we dealt with everything from financials to sorting out estates when someone dies or whatever it is. Our office is literally a goldmine for anyone looking for gossip details of people's private lives. There were a lot of secrets that became public knowledge, but before this turned into a novel of epic proportions, I'll just skip to the final drama that turned my life upside down. Lucille went beyond taking photos of parts of the files when she managed to have stolen moments in my office. She helped herself to Penny's entire file history with the firm. I still don't know how she got into my boss's office where the majority were held, but she was a determined old lady, I'll give her that. The files were removed on the Friday, and we did not notice anything until all heck broke loose the following Monday. I'll leave the details for the next update, as it deserves its own chapter in this drama, before we get to the ending, which surprised even me. The benefit of me already living through this is that I know what's coming. But for all you out there, fasten your seatbelts, please, as it's about to get bumpy. What's up, everybody? Mr. Reddito here. So that was not a lie. These next 2 updates are definitely considered bumpy. There's 2 updates left in the story. I hope you guys are enjoying this juicy, gossipy one this time. And let's jump into update 4. Picture the scene. Sorry, I like to be dramatic. I always said if I was not a lawyer, I would write cheap, trashy novels for a living. Saturday, late morning, at the only diner in town, and a group of respectable older ladies are meeting for brunch. Or, as I like to call it, brunch and jerk. Penny is holding court with her little tribe of loyal ladies, and in walks out the queen bee, herself, and sits 2 tables away with her tribe of followers. I was helping Rick out in the diner, along with his dad, as it was really busy time. We get a lot of tourists in the summer for the mountains and walking. It started like a gentle murmur of voices, subtly throwing shade at each other, and ended in a screaming match that stunned any visitor and put me right in the middle of it. So, I was not paying much attention as it started off the same old lady stuff. Petty comments about how someone's dressed, what color they'd highlighted their hair to hide the gray, and how bad their cakes were. Yeah, neither of these women had ever cooked, so they were actually insulting their cleaning ladies. The Lucille threw in what she thought would make her the winner once and for all, and finally I just had to pay attention. Lucille got to her feet and sauntered over to Penny's table, a sly smile across her face. At this, Rick, his dad, and I began to pay attention as we knew she was out for blood. Penny had just made a comment about Lucille's son Rick, only being successful because of his father's hard work in creating the diners, and Lucille saw her way in. Still smiling, she stood looking down at Penny and said words that still chills me to the bone whenever I think about it. Rick works hard to carry on his father's legacy. What do your children do? Oh yes, forgive me. I forgot you killed them, didn't you? It's a wonder you still drink alcohol after crashing the car that took your children's lives, huh? Lucille did a show of shaking her head sadly at the drink in Penny's hand and sauntered back to her seat. Time stopped. Everyone tried to process what had just happened. And then, well, Penny exploded. I should probably explain what happened after that, and Penny had issues with alcohol and had been married before. Her first husband had divorced her due to her problems with drinking, and one evening when she was angry about the divorce, she had too many drinks, and she decided to take her 2 young children out in the car to go to her mother's. Well, they never made it. The car crash was devastating, and Penny was lucky to escape it. There's no way that Lucille could know that. It was only in our files, as there's a record of the criminal case she faced, and, well, she found the papers. Penny wasn't stupid, and it did not take a genius to work out where Lucille could have possibly gotten the information. Before anyone could stop her, she launched herself at Lucille, calling her every name under the sun. Whilst Lucille tried to look like a wounded party, then Penny turned to me. By this point, most people have put 2 and 2 together as well, and came up with 5. They assume, as Lucille's daughter-in-law, it's obvious I was feeding her the information to help keep her place in the town society rankings. Penny stood in front of me, rage-filled in her eyes, and spat out this. I'll make sure you never practice law again, and stormed out with her group behind her. All I could do was look around like a stunned deer caught in a hunter's spotlight and choke out, "What have you done?" over and over and over towards Lucille. Lucille just looked at me, smiled smugly, and said this, "I won. That's what I've just done. I won." That's when deep down in the pit of my stomach I felt something I've never felt before. Absolute pure rage. I hated her with every fiber of my body, and I vowed right then and there behind the counter of a small diner in a nowhere small town that she would definitely pay for everything she's done, and that stupid, gossiping queen bee hierarchy that she clearly craved was about to be ripped from her hands, once and for all. As I realized that I had a fight on my hands to prove I've not been the source of the info, I also began to plan. My mother-in-law and all the women like her needed to watch their backs because a new queen bee was about to rise, and I would end the power of gossip once and for all. Of course, once I calmed down and was sobbing in Rick's arms, I kinda lost a lot of that rage. But I'm telling you right now, she will still pay for this, and I just need to work out how. Update number 5, final update. The following week or so was awful as I was hauled into work to answer question after question about how the files had found their way into Lucille's possession. I defended myself over and over until I was exhausted. It was not just my reputation on the line. The files have been in the office of the boss. Finally, happy I have not been deliberately stealing files to fund my mother-in-law's need to be the woman of the top of the food chain, we put a plan in place to clear our name and get revenge on these women who needed to be taken down a peg, or maybe 6. I laid out the plan that had been forming in my mind over the time since Lucille caused chaos at the diner, and my boss helped tidy up the loose ends. We were lawyers after all, we had the benefit of training behind us. So, the following day, I phoned Lucille and asked her to come to the house to meet for lunch and talk about things. I told her that I'd actually been impressed with the way that she took down her rival and wanted to learn from her. I said that I would be able to find a way to make the lawsuit Penny would inevitably launch go away, and I would help her in the future to keep control of the town by watching out for information we could use. Any person with an ounce of common sense would have known that this was a fairy tale. I did not have that kind of power. However, Lucille was high on her victory and was strutting around town like a peacock, unaware that the looks she was getting were not the looks of awe, she thought. They were looks of disgust at how low she sank to reach the top. She turned up for lunch ready to crow about her cleverness, and that's what I counted on. See, my boss was good friends with local law enforcement, and I was wearing a hidden recording device, a wire. All it took was me saying how amazed I was that Lucille had gotten to the files, and she told me everything. She went on and on about how she had broken into my boss's office, how she took the photos of all the files in my office as I wasn't in the room, and how she had Penny's personal files sitting at her house. I told her that I was going to join her in her crusade to be the most powerful woman in town. She sat there with a huge grin on her face, waiting for me to congratulate her on her scheme. Instead, I told her in great details what a despicable human being she was. How I could not understand this small-town mentality of trying to destroy each other for absolutely no reason at all, and nothing to gain. And thanks to her need to gloat, I'd personally be making sure that Penny had all the details she needed to press charges against her. I gave her a rundown of just how serious her position was, now that she's admitted to stealing files from a lawyer's office and having them in her possession. I sent a text to my boss while we were talking, and they were waiting to retrieve the files from her house. See, Lucille was furious, and there was a lot of yelling about how I was betraying her and Rick should have never married me. But I didn't care. I was done with her in this stupid town. Things were set in motion after that, and in time, Lucille was arrested, charged and prosecuted for theft and blackmail. She had tried to ask Penny for money not to hand the files over, or the papers. I testified against her, and happily Rick stood by me. I wish I could say that Lucille got what she deserved, but she did not get the punishment she should have. It turns out small-time judges don't want to put elderly women in jail, and she was just put on probation. Fined a large amount of personal damages owed to Penny. Penny and her husband then moved away, and I really can't say I blamed them. I would have loved to have done the same, but Rick loves his diner, and his father had recently become single. He didn't want to leave him. Thankfully, after the trial, people realized that I was an innocent party, and I was able to return to my job. Things have changed in some ways, and the women's group are quieter, and while Lucille, now living in a small, modest apartment, keeps herself to herself. A few women approached me asking if I would join their group, but I said I would rather jump into a pit of vipers than join that group. I also warned them that I would be starting a law clinic offering free legal advice to anyone who was the victim of a smear campaign, and I would sue the bullies with all the power of the law available to me. Well, I can say after that threat, life's been a lot quieter, and in my own way, I am now the queen bee. As the local ladies are scared that if they put a foot out of line, I'll help their victims sue them for as much as we can get. Turns out it's quite fun being the one with power. Who would have thought? Not gonna lie, guys, I don't even know where to start this. Who was the more toxic here, Lucille or Penny? In my opinion, it has to be Lucille because what she did was absolutely vile. First of all, she brought up a very sensitive topic with the car accident that Penny was in that ultimately cost her children their life. And not only that, she decided it was okay to break into a law firm, to steal these documents and just expect nothing bad to happen to her. Guys, please let me know your thoughts on this story. If you guys have been watching my stories for a long time, you might remember the story about Stabra, one of the most evil mother-in-laws we've ever read. I want to know, in like a rating from 1 to 10, how close is Lucille to Stabra? Drop your comments down below, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're not subscribed, consider subscribing, and I hope to see you guys tomorrow.